Story 1. The map had promised a route that cut 2 hours off the drive to Denver. What it had delivered was a mistake printed in faded, green ink, leading us onto a forgotten network of gravel roads the consistency of old, broken teeth. My name is Marcus. Beside me, Anya, my fiancée, stared out the window of our beaten-up SUV, the late afternoon sun throwing long, distorted shadows across her face. We had been arguing. Something about the GPS, something else about my insistence on taking the scenic route, but the exhaustion of driving for 12 straight hours had leached the energy from our voices, leaving only a thick, resentful silence. "This can't be right," Anya murmured, pointing. Ahead, the road opened into a small valley, cradling a cluster of buildings that looked less like a town and more like a collection of props abandoned after a film shoot. A weathered sign, listing precariously on a single post, read, "Oakhaven, Pop. 48. It was the silence that hit us first. Not just the absence of traffic, but an absolute, crushing quiet that seemed to absorb the sounds of our own car. When I finally cut the engine near a defunct gas pump, the only noise was the metallic tink-tink-tink of the cooling manifold. "Hello, anyone?" Anya's voice, a thin thread in the vast quiet, sounded unnaturally loud. The town itself was a study in arrested decay. A single main street, flanked by buildings of graying wood and peeling paint. A general store with dusty windows. A church with a spire tilting slightly east, and a row of clapboard houses, each one identical in its air of profound neglect. There were lights on in some windows, a sickly, yellow-orange glow, but no movement. No cars. No dogs barking. No breeze stirring the dry weeds. "It feels like we drove into a photograph," I whispered. We needed gas, but the pump was clearly out of service. We needed directions. We needed any sign that 48 human beings lived here. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out, the gravel crunching loudly under my boots. Anya stayed put, clutching her phone, which predictably showed 0 bars. The door to the general store, marked McClintock's, was ajar. I pushed it slowly, the bell above the frame failing to ring, the wire long since severed or perhaps just worn through. The air inside was stale and heavy, smelling faintly of dust, old flour, and something else. A musky, animal smell, like damp earth. The shelves were stocked, mostly, canned goods with labels faded to illegibility, cleaning supplies, and a surprising variety of fresh bread displayed on a counter, though it looked oddly pale, almost bleached. Behind the counter was an old cash register and a ledger lying open. On the wall, beneath a calendar stuck on October 1987, was a small, handwritten sign, "Be back soon." "Don't touch the pantry, McClintock," I called out, my heart starting to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "Hello. We just need directions." Silence. Only the hum of an old refrigerator in the back, a sound so lonely it felt like the only living thing in the room. I walked to the ledger. The last entry, dated 3 days prior, listed a transaction, 4 loaves. 2 jars pickles. 1 ounce payment. 1 ounce payment. I heard Anya call from the car, her voice tight with panic. "Marcus, come on, please. I don't like this." As I turned to leave, my flashlight beam swept across the floor, catching something nestled beneath the dusty barrel. It was a child's toy, a wooden block, carved simply into the shape of a man. But the carving was wrong. It had no face. Where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, the wood was sanded smooth, unnervingly blank. I backed out of the store, the silence seeming to press in on me. I got into the car, locking the doors and starting the engine immediately. "Go, Marcus, go. Which way? Anya begged. I don't know, but we're not stopping again. I spun the SUV around, throwing up a rooster tail of gravel, and sped toward the edge of town. As we passed the dilapidated church, I glanced in my rearview mirror. In the second-story window of the house directly opposite the church, a light flickered. And then, I saw the faces. They weren't looking at the road or at our car. They were looking at each other. In every visible window, in the houses, the store, even the church belfry, there were faces. Not moving, not reacting, just staring in perfect profile toward the center of the town, utterly still. And they were all blank. Smooth. Not just expressionless, but completely, physically devoid of features, like the wooden toy, but rendered in human flesh. The silence suddenly made sense. They had no mouths to speak, no noses to breathe, no eyes to observe us. But they could feel us. They were the town, and they were waiting. My foot slammed the accelerator, and we tore out of Oakhaven. 50 miles later, in a cheap motel outside a slightly larger, thankfully noisy town, we called the state police. They listened patiently to my hysterical description of the blank-faced population, the silent store, and the chilling silence. "Sir," the officer said, his voice measured, "I can assure you, there is no community called Oakhaven in that county. There hasn't been anything but scrubland out there for 50 years. Are you sure you weren't drowsy?" I ended the call. Anya and I didn't speak about it for the rest of the night. But the next morning, as she was packing, I saw her slip a small, smooth wooden block into her pocket. The carving of a little man. It had no face. I never asked her where she found it. The silent countryside had swallowed the town, but the town had sent something back with us. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think I hear the faint, lonely tink-tink-tink of the cooling manifold, followed by that crushing, absolute silence. And I wonder which way Anya is facing as she stares into the dark. Story 2. The listing had been suspiciously cheap. A decommissioned forest ranger's cabin, set back half a mile from the road, with its own small dock jutting into the placid, ink-dark surface of Blackwood Lake. For Leo, a grad student seeking absolute isolation to finish his thesis on fungal decay, it was perfect. He bought it sight unseen, trusting the shaky satellite images and the realtor's enthusiastic, if slightly forced, assurance that the tranquility was unmatched. The first 2 weeks of October were idyllic. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The lake, true to its name, was almost black, reflecting the tall, dense pines that encircled it in a perfect, mirrored circumference. He worked all day, sometimes until his eyes blurred, and slept soundly in the absolute absence of urban noise. The quiet, however, eventually gave way to something else, the water. It started with the fishing line. Leo, a poor fisherman but a persistent one, would cast his lure off the rickety dock every evening. He never caught anything, but he didn't mind. It was meditative. On the 15th night, when he reeled in his line, the lure wasn't bare. It was tangled. Not snagged on a log or caught in the reeds, but bound tightly with something fibrous and thick, like coarse, wet horsehair, or perhaps a bundle of soaked twine. It was dark green, almost black when wet, and when he pulled at it, it smelled powerfully of brackish water and low-tide decay. He dropped the lure back into the lake and decided it was just some sort of unusual algae bloom. The next morning, he found the Tangle on his dock. It was a patch perhaps 3 feet long and a foot wide, seemingly pulled up from the lake floor and draped across the weathered planks. It was the same material that had snagged his line, a dense, braided mass of dark fibers. They were strangely strong, holding their shape even when Leo prodded them with his boot. They didn't feel like plant matter. They felt taut, almost muscular. As he bent down for a closer look, he noticed that within the tangle, small, iridescent flakes, like shattered bits of mussel shell or fish scales, glinted faintly. He kicked the mass back into the lake. It sank without a ripple. The tangle returned that night. And the night after. Each time, it appeared further up the dock, closer to the shore. By the fourth night, it was coiled up beneath the cabin's steps. It was growing, too. The mass was now roughly the size of a tire, its fibers woven together so tightly they looked like a coarse, black hide. Leo could no longer dismiss it as natural. This wasn't seaweed or moss. It had a structure, a terrifying, silent geometry. Fear, cold and sharp, finally cut through his scholarly calm. He grabbed a pair of industrial shears, fully intending to chop it up and burn it, but when he approached the tangle, he hesitated. He heard a sound, a low, sucking schloop that came from the water, right beneath the dock. It was the sound of something large, wet, and heavy shifting in the mud. He looked down, his flashlight beam piercing the black surface. The light didn't reach the bottom. Blackwood was notoriously deep, but it illuminated the upper few feet. And he saw them. Dozens of the dark, braided strands were trailing away from the main mass on the steps, dipping back into the lake. They weren't broken off. They were attached. They pulsed gently, like veins carrying a slow, dark fluid. He felt the dock tremble. He backed away slowly, retreating into the cabin and slamming the door shut. He locked it, though he knew a thin wooden door would offer no defense against whatever was making the dock planks flex and groan. Through the single, grimy window, he watched. The tangle on the steps seemed to sigh, settling heavier onto the wood. Suddenly, a sound like wet canvas tearing came from the mass. A new fiber, thick as his thumb, shot out from the central knot and adhered itself to the wooden step. Then another, and another, until the whole structure seemed to be sewing itself to the cabin. Leo spent the night huddled in the corner, listening to the lake. The soft schloop noises had become rhythmic, a slow, ponderous intake and release of water, like a colossal, wet bellows working just beneath the surface. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in bruised purples and grays, the noise stopped. Leo crept to the window. The tangle was gone from the steps. But the wood was not clean. Where the mass had been, the wood was stained black, and the texture of the planking had changed. The surface looked softened, like wood left in the deepest parts of a swamp for decades. The grain was swollen and dark, and faint, shallow grooves were etched into the surface, grooves where the fibers had apparently rested. He knew he had to leave. He had to pack his laptop, his thesis, and get out before the sun set again. He opened the door cautiously. The air was heavy with the smell of musk and ozone. His eyes were immediately drawn to the boat, a small, aluminum skiff he'd left tied to the dock. The boat was sitting much lower in the water than it should have been. And covering the entire interior, like a thick, dark blanket, was the Tangle. It filled the hull completely, woven around the seats, the oarlocks, and the motor. It had transformed the simple boat into a low floating nest of pulsating, obsidian fibers. More terrifyingly, it was feeding. Slowly, deliberately, the Tangle was pulling at the aluminum hull. He could see the fibers gripping the metal, which was dulling and corroding under the contact, the fibers seemingly leaching the very substance of the boat into themselves. A faint, sickly sound, like the whisper of grinding teeth, came from the dock. Leo ran. He didn't bother with the laptop, the thesis, or the keys. He ran through the trees, blindly following the dirt path that led back to the road. He didn't stop until he reached the highway, where he flagged down a bewildered trucker. He told the police, of course. They sent a couple of deputies out to the cabin. They returned 30 minutes later, looking pale and confused. "Nothing, sir," the lead deputy reported. "The cabin is empty. The dock is there. The lake is quiet. We found a few patches of dark algae on the shore, but nothing like you described." "The boat," Leo stammered. "Did you see the aluminum boat?" "No boat, sir. Just the bare dock." Leo knew they were either lying or, worse, too late. The Tangle had been efficient. A month later, Leo was trying to restart his life in a city apartment, the sound of traffic a welcome comfort. He still couldn't look at still water without a shudder. One evening, he was boiling pasta. He drained the water into the sink and was about to discard the pot when he paused. The metal of the pot, a cheap, thin stainless steel, looked duller than it should have. And at the exact spot where the water level had been, he saw them. Faint, shallow grooves, like the ones etched into the dock planks. And nestled right beneath the sink's drain opening, a small, wet ball of thick, dark green fiber. It was the size of a walnut, pulsating faintly in the lingering steam. Leo backed away from the sink, his breath catching in his throat. The Tangle didn't need the lake anymore. It had found the pipes. It had found the wet, dark system. It had found his home. Story 3. Alistair Thorne didn't believe in ghosts, but he certainly believed in forgetting. And the purpose of the White Library, tucked away in the least used corner of the university's ancient campus, seemed to be dedicated entirely to the art of letting things be forgotten. It wasn't white at all. It was constructed of gray stone so old it seemed to absorb all available light, and its basement archives were legendary for their sheer inaccessibility. Alistair had been hired as the sole archivist of curiosities, a euphemism for the man tasked with cataloging and eventually discarding the university's junk. Broken scientific equipment, defunct administrative ledgers, and books too fragile or too obscure to merit preservation. His workplace was a labyrinth of mildewed paper and dust motes dancing in the meager light of bare fluorescent bulbs. One afternoon, while clearing a shelving unit that had visibly bowed under decades of pressure, he found a box marked simply, S. Private. The box was a heavy, lead-lined affair, sealed with a tarnished, complex brass lock. It took him 2 hours to drill out the ancient mechanism, his heart thrumming with the excitement only a true academic hoarder can understand. Inside, there was no jewelry or money, only paper. Not books, but a collection of unbound, handwritten pages, all in the same meticulous, crabbed script. They were dated sporadically from 1898 to 1910. The author, judging by the initials on a loose title page, was Professor Silas Vane. Vane had taught natural philosophy, an old name for science, at the university before disappearing in 1911. The local legend was that he had walked into the nearby woods and simply vanished. Alistair began reading. The initial entries were dry, clinical observations of meteorological phenomena. Then, the tone shifted. Vane started describing his experiments with sympathetic resonance, the idea that sounds, once made, never truly vanished, but simply echoed on an ever-diminishing wavelength, waiting for the right frequency to bring them back. The logs grew obsessive. Vane claimed to have built an instrument, a series of intricately carved, hollow cedar cones wired with thin silver filaments, designed to capture these faint, ancient echoes. He named it the phonographic retractor. Alistair snorted. Nonsense, of course. Yet, the precision of Vane's engineering diagrams was unnerving. Then, Vane started recording his results. October 3, 1905. Initial test successful. Heard the soft rush of water flowing in the stream bed before the university existed. A clean, meaningless sound. Confirmation of principle. October 18, 1905. Retractor tuned deeper. Captured the sound of axes in the valley, the timber used to construct the very building in which I now sit. The voices of the builders, indistinct but clearly shouting instructions. They sound excited. The entries grew darker. Vane began tuning the machine deeper and deeper, not for faint sounds, but for sounds attached to profound moments of human experience. November 5, 1906. The retractor is fixed at the resonance point of grief. Heard the screams. Not simple screams of pain, but the final, rending sound of loss. They are louder than the axes. I can pinpoint the location. The old infirmary annex. I heard her calling for him. The sound has weight. It leaves a residue. Must proceed with caution. Alistair felt a prickle of cold on the back of his neck. He was in the heart of an old university, a place that had seen countless tragedies over centuries. What kind of acoustic residue would such a place hold? He continued reading, fascinated and appalled. Vane claimed that by repeatedly capturing a sound of extreme emotional weight, the retractor was not merely listening to the past, but pulling the sound forward, compressing the time between its initial utterance and its recording. The final entries were written in a frantic scrawl, smeared in places with what looked suspiciously like dried blood. May 10, 1910. The retractor is humming without power. It has achieved a self-sustaining resonance. It is not capturing sounds anymore. It is pulling the source material, the resonance, out of the past. I tried to dismantle the cones. They bled. May 12, 1910. I can hear them without the machine. They are the screams from the infirmary. But they are not echoes. They are coming from the wall behind the chimney breast. The air is cold. The thing they left behind, the sound shape, is here. It wants its voice back. The last entry was only a date, May 15, 1910. And a single, terrifying word. Hush. Alistair slammed the pages shut. It was just mad ramblings. A footnote in the history of science gone wrong. He locked the papers in a secure file cabinet. But the silence of the white library suddenly felt different. It was no longer a natural quiet. It felt forced. That night, Alistair went home, but he couldn't sleep. He kept hearing tiny, faint noises, not quite real, like whispering air or the rustle of dry paper, always just beyond the threshold of hearing. He returned to the archive the next day, determined to be rational. He was halfway through cataloging a pile of broken glass slides when he heard it. A sound, clear as a bell, coming from the far end of the basement, near the sealed-off tunnel that supposedly led to the old infirmary. It was a cough. A dry, rattling, painful cough. The sound of an old man dying. Alistair froze, dropping the slide. He knew he was the only person in the basement. "Hello," he called out. The cough came again, closer this time, accompanied by the distinct, wet sound of a man clearing his throat. Alistair grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and walked toward the sound. The air grew perceptibly colder as he approached the bricked-up archway of the old tunnel. "This isn't funny," he tried, but his voice cracked. A sound returned, but not a voice. It was a loud, sharp rap. Thump. Like a heavy knuckle hitting a hard surface. Thump. Thump. It was the sound of a fist hitting a coffin lid. A rhythmic, muffled insistence. Alistair shone his light on the wall. The brickwork was perfectly sealed. But he could feel the vibrations. And in the dead air, he heard the faint, wet sound of human breath being drawn in, followed by a wheezing release. He realized the horror. The sounds Vane had pulled forward weren't ghosts. They were the acoustic energy of past moments of death and despair, so profoundly real that they had taken on a presence, a sound shape, that now inhabited the very walls. The tapping intensified, frantic now, accompanied by a sound of deep, chest-shattering sobbing. Alistair turned and ran. He fled the archive, the coughs and the muffled thumps chasing him up the cold, winding stairs. He never went back to the White Library. He resigned, left the city, and took a quiet, unremarkable data entry job in a place where the loudest sound was the clicking of a keyboard. But 2 months later, in his sterile, sound-dampened apartment, he was heating up his dinner. He set the stainless steel saucepan on the burner. When the water started to boil, it made a strange sound. Not a normal bubbling, but a low, sustained hum. The pitch was exact, complex, and deeply resonant. It was the sound of the phonographic retractor. Alistair looked down at the pot. He wasn't hearing the sound of the machine. He was hearing the resonance itself, vibrating the thin metal. And then, from the humming pot, a new, clear sound emerged, right at the frequency of boiling water. A choked, rasping whisper, thick with dust and ancient regret, right in his ear. Found you, archivist. Now, listen. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.